Alrighty, welcome everyone. Now today we're going to do a bit of a summary of all the different teaching strategies that I think are important or essential to today's work that we do as education professionals in actual classrooms. So I'm trying to be as practical as possible. Depending on who you talk to, you'll get a different answer to what that individual thinks is the top teaching strategies. And indeed, I define teaching strategies in a very different way to everyone else. So I like to just think of teaching strategies as the types of things that we do, the activities we do as teachers or as teacher aides, or as any other type of education professional, whether you're a trainer or coach or whatever, the types of things that we regularly do in a classroom around the whole teaching and learning thing, whether that's a technique or a skill or whatever. I kind of just classify it and put them into that nice, neat little basket. Again, for practical purposes. I'm not too concerned about the technicalities because I like to think about how that strategy there and that strategy there can be used tomorrow to help that child or that person, that student, become better at actually learning or better at a particular topic or better at know more about a particular subject or something like that. So either way, all of these things and the purpose for why we do teaching strategies is to add a bunch of options to our tool belt, as I like to say, or to our toolbox, so that we can choose the best elements that suit us, that suit our personality, that suit our teaching style, that suit the subject, and so on and so forth. So you'll probably disagree with some of these, and that's perfectly fine. In my book, I go through 104-ish type strategies, and even then, a lot of those can be divided up into dozens of other strategies, or maybe not dozens, but a lot of them are, I guess, a combination of multiple strategies under one heading. So there are tons of teaching strategies out there, teaching techniques out there, and approaches and theories and things like this. I've just chosen 25. I've only written 20 because, or I've only numbered 20. I just wanted to make sure I didn't run out of room because I want a bit of space to be able to do some scribbling. And some people have already commented on the way in which I sort of scribble on the board, and not in a bad way, but it is interesting to get feedback along those lines and how it's, I guess, a little bit unusual. This is how I do my board work when I'm in an actual classroom, whether I'm teaching kids or teaching adults. I do heaps of board work. Not everyone does, but a lot of people do. It's not to say that's best practice or whatever, but I like to write everything on the board. And sometimes if it's not important, I scribble it down and it's there. My handwriting is quite messy, but that just gives you an idea of one way of going about doing things when you're teaching kids. And even if I'm working with 2 or 3 and it's some type of intensive thing or whatever, I still like to have that visual cue, I guess, or that visual reminder that's there to back up what we're saying and our auditory learning, I guess. I just think that's important. Not necessarily essential, but certainly if you do have a whiteboard near to where you're working, I would think that best practice is probably to utilize it as much as you can. And you'll find students like to take photos or they'll write down notes almost identical to what you're doing. And then as you're going through and explaining stuff throughout the lesson or even the next lesson, then you can make connections between things and draw lines and that kind of stuff. So you'll see in a lot of my other videos where by the end of it, assuming I haven't erased things, and this is only a small whiteboard. One of the other classrooms I work in has a whiteboard that's probably 6 times as long as this. That you've got heaps of space and you can scribble all over it, and it does at the end of a class, so at the end of an average maths class or an average English class, it can just look like a bit of a mess, but that's just the style that I've always used. So if that works for you, give it a try. If it doesn't, then that's fine. Okay, so to get started talking about teaching strategies, what's a nice colour I can use? I'll just use black. these aren't necessarily in any specific order. One of the problems with teaching strategies is that they don't exist in a bubble. They don't exist in isolation to each other. So if you're really good at one particular teaching strategy, but you have no clue about a lot of other ones, then you're really going to struggle. And you may not even realize that you're struggling or that you're not delivering the best type of service to your students because you're hyper-focused in one area. So for me, and my personal belief anyway, is that we should be not focused across all the different types of teaching strategies, but be aware of them and be aware of their pros and their cons and how they can be used. And to really try and stay away from this idea that this is my favourite teaching strategy or this is the way to do it, this is how you should do it. That's something that happens in every profession, I guess, but particularly I notice it in education and particularly at that sort of academic level where people write about these types of things a lot. People do tend to favour certain strategies and they almost defend those strategies to the death. And I think that's just not the best way to go about doing things. So you will have your favourites and some that you are good at and some that you aren't good at, but don't discount those ones that may not sit with you, I guess, ideologically or whatnot. So I talk a lot about the cognitivist type stuff, which is about, I guess, more old-fashioned type teaching, traditional teaching in a way. But I'm a high school teacher by trade. So even though I've taught primary school, I'm also focused on high school for a lot of things. But a lot of the stuff there is relatable to most of primary school anyway. It is useful and does get used just the same. But the early childhood area, which seems to be moving in that constructivist type direction, I'm not overly fond of it, but there is a place for it. I just don't think that you should devote 100% of your time to one particular ism or one particular ideology or whatever. So that's my advice. If you don't watch any more of this or you skip to the end to see what the list is, then what I would most like you to take out of this is that you should be aware of, cognizant of, and use a range of strategies, not just one strategy. Because if you're like me, you regularly change your mind on things as you learn things, as you practice, as you read things, and so on and so forth. So even when I do these webinars, I'll be going through it thinking at the start about one thing, and towards the end I've kind of changed my mind on what I think is important or how different bits link together and things like that. So when it comes to teaching and as you're practicing these types of things in the real world, your beliefs and your thoughts about what works and what doesn't will change with your experiences. So just bear that in mind. There's that flexibility that is important as far as working in this industry, because it is a people-orientated industry. And these types of things, as I always say, try to categorise ways of doing things into neat little boxes. But if you're in a people industry like we are, categorising things into neat little boxes, while it can help us learn and study and figure out what best practice is and try and put rules around those things, it's really hard because it's such a complex and multidimensional task going about teaching someone. So the one other thing I would like to just quickly point out as far as teaching strategies is something of a definition around this idea of teaching strategies, because not a definition around teaching strategies per se, but around teaching specifically and what that means, because I think it's important to really have a think about what teaching or training means before we look at these strategies, and there is a good reason for that. So if you go to a store and buy a newspaper or a book, that person is not teaching you anything. They are handing over information. They're giving you a newspaper or they're giving you a book or whatever, but they're not actually teaching you anything. So what that means for us is that there's another step involved in that process. Somewhere in there, not only are we giving information to the student or students, passing on that information somehow. And there's lots of different ways we can do that. We can divide it up into little bits and pieces and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, we're just like a bookseller or a person selling newspapers. At some point, we are handing over information to another person. Now, I think we can all agree that that isn't teaching. So something else happens that means that information is provided to that student. We have some goals. So that's where our goals come from. As soon as we decide that we have information or there is information out there and we want to help that student to develop that information or to understand that information somehow or to interact with that information and learn new skills or whatever, whenever we decide that we're going to be that person or we're going to facilitate it, so not necessarily teach it per se, but facilitate it, straight away, regardless of your ideologies about teaching or anything, your philosophies or whatever, you're setting goals. And that's why I think I'm going to put up here as my first strategy is goals, so setting goals. So as I always say, whether you're the hippiest of teachers or teacher aides and or you're ultra traditional and structured, you're always going to be setting goals. You may not be conscious of those goals, but you are setting goals for students to learn. So all of these, by the way, I've done various different videos on, so please watch those. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on each one, but I will go through them a little bit for a minute or so, just so that we can get something of an overview. So back to where we were saying before about what it means to be teaching. Obviously, there is that process of saying, okay, here is the information, and then this person here is trying to give that information to this person here. So they're trying to pass that information across. This person's trying to give information to this person. This person is, let's call them the teacher. Right, and this person is the student. This may seem stupid and silly, but there is a point to this. Now that information there, if we just give that person information, we're not teaching them. As I was saying, you're passing on a book, passing on a newspaper, and I do see a lot of courses where that is developed and called things like online learning and whatnot. So you've just got to be careful. I did a video the other day about the little known types of learning or modes of learning, and one of them was online learning and technology learning. That type of I'm passing information to you happens a lot around that technology space. And one of the lessons from that webinar that I was doing was that to think about best practice as far as how the old school traditional strategies such as explicit instruction, setting goals, chunking, scaffolding, guided, shared learning, etc., how that works in a technology heavy environment. Because otherwise, if you're telling kids, go on the internet, research this or play this game or whatever, even if it's like educational based, you're actually just a bookseller or the newspaper, the guy that sells the newspaper, right? You're not actually a teacher per se or a facilitator or whatever. You're just handing that information across to a not even another person. You're handing, because they're not a student if you're not a teacher, you're actually just handing that from one person to another. It just happens to be that you're of a different age or different employment position or whatever. So, and then, anyway, so the next thing that happens is if we actually want that student, that person there, to engage with that information or that concept or that skill, this person has to do something. And by doing that, they then become a teacher. And those things that they do are strategies. So when we come here and we look at that information there, we can divide it up into little pieces. So that's one way that we can help that person to learn it quicker, learn it more effectively, and not have to learn through trial and error by making mistakes over a 5 or 6 year period. We can teach them something in a couple of weeks or a couple of days or whatever. So you can imagine, for example, if you're teaching someone to do surgery, as a bit of an extreme example, we don't want them to learn that by trial and error. We don't just give them a book and say, okay, here's a book, read it, answer a couple of multiple choice questions, and you're a surgeon. Off you go. That isn't teaching per se. Well, it's not teaching at all. Yes, we hand that information across, and we can hand it across in different ways, but we also put other things around it. So we put other strategies around. So we've got strategy 1, strategy 2, strategy 3, and so on and so forth. And it helps that person to learn faster, effectively, efficiently. And they learn things like the tricks of the trade, as I like to call them, and so on and so forth. So that's where I think it's important to just very carefully identify what it means to teach and what it means as opposed to handing information to another person, and what the difference is between handing information to another person and actually teaching it. And that's where the strategies and these types of things come into effect. Now you can see why I started off with a goal, because the first thing here, before we even get to that person, we've got a goal of some description. So we're like, well, I want this person to learn this in a certain amount of time. Or I want this person to learn how to, if you with little kids, socialise with this other little kid. Or you want them to develop their gross motor skills. Or you want them to learn some type of calculus or whatever. Either way, that person has a goal. Quite often you will have that goal before you even know who this person is, by nature of your employment or whatever. Now what you can see here is that I'm trying to conceptualize that into just a little drawing. This stuff here, if we're using various different strategies to teach it, it's not enough to just use one strategy. So just to make that more clear, it's not enough just to use one strategy, because that is not far enough away or far enough down the path of teaching. It's still pretty closely related to just handing that information across. So that's no more than, really a bit of a conversation or whatnot. It must have, for it to look like teaching, for it to be, to pass, I guess, the pub test of what the difference is between handing information across and teaching, there must be multiple different ways, a multi-pronged approach in which we go about trying to get that person here to understand that information in a way that matches the goals that we had when we first set about trying to give them that information. There is one way in which this doesn't apply, by the way, and that's with self-directed learning. But with self-directed learning, there is still a process there, except for that person there sort of has the goal to become that person there, or vice versa, depending on which way you want to do it. So in other words, they still have that goal of improving themselves. They just have a bit of a vision of what that looks like in the future. So they're still going through that process, but they're not. And they have to go about using various different strategies as well to get that information to look and be conceptualized and understood in the way that they want it to, almost as if there was a teacher there. So they're self-taught is the word that we quite often use, but strategies are still involved. So point is, before you get started here, I don't like to identify I do like to identify these individually, but I want you to also think about how they relate to each other. And I'll point out some key facts around that, because I think if you're doing, say, play-based learning or constructivist learning, and you say, well, I'm a constructivist teacher, and you chuck all the rest in the bin, then you're limiting yourself. But on the other hand, if you're taking a more traditional approach and you're chucking out all the more modern, cool stuff out, then again, you're limiting yourself. So it's important to see how these things all relate. Now, I've done a video on goal setting. At the end of the day, if you've got a lesson plan or an activity plan, whether you're working with 35 students or you're working with 700 students or you're working with 2 students in some type of remedial program, or you're just a teacher aide that circulates around and you help these 3 students, or you're a teacher and you're just circulating around and you help this one individual student for 2 minutes, imagine that even those little periods of time are effectively lesson plans, right? Or activity plans. And at that point, you will set a goal. So you'll have a goal up here, and then down the bottom here, you will also have some type of review or whatever, even if it's one sentence. And you'll talk to the student, some type of consolidation/review process. So if you sit down with the student for 3 minutes and you say, okay, what's the problem? Here's the problem. You go through that process of diagnosing what that problem is, and then you go about doing some type of teaching activity to try and help them achieve that goal. So we figure out what the problem is, and then from the problem we figure out what the goal is, and then at the end we have to make the decision about whether we actually met that goal. That's one way of thinking about goals. The other thing with goals is we make sure they're always smart. Okay, so watch my video on goals, and you just Google that. There's millions of bits of information about SMART goals. If we're also doing a period where doing a program or a unit of work or a course or a qualification or whatever over a period of time, obviously we've got goals at the end there. They can be your main goals, they can be secondary goals, cross-curriculum goals, cross-curriculum priorities, whatever. There's lots of different types of goals. And then throughout here, we've got milestones or progress goals. And during the actual lessons, we've got micro goals. And the one thing one of the things I like to emphasise with goals is that it is a really good way of helping students to, micro goals in particular, is a really good way of helping students to develop their self-esteem. Now, self-esteem is the precursor to motivation. Motivation is the precursor to meeting learning goals. So, if you're not motivated, then you're not going to achieve anything. And students start doing things like, trying to get kicked out of class or not showing up or not paying attention or whatever. Okay, so that's setting goals. Now, the next thing we will talk about is explicit instruction. I just wanted to follow up quickly as a last little bit about that aspect where we were talking about the definition of teaching and transmitting information from one student to, or from the teacher to the student. There is some research out there, and I'll write this up so that you can see it. 68% of the time, untrained people give the answers to students when they ask a question. So if a student says, I don't understand question 7, or I can't read this sentence, or I don't know what to do here, or whatever, 68% of the time they will get given the answer. So in this little, analogy / metaphor-ish diagram, let's call it a diagram, illustration. So in this little illustration, we've got a teacher passing on information to a student, and we've realised and decided that that's not really teaching. And what it needs to happen for that passing on of information to then become teaching is we need to introduce strategies and use strategies. That's the whole purpose of strategies, not strategy, strategies. There has to be that plural, right? But unfortunately, what the research says, this is not me inventing this is actual research that was done, about 68% of the time people who are untrained, as in teacher aides or teachers, well, they wouldn't be teachers, but say teacher aides who are untrained, who go into a classroom, so they're parent helpers or they're employed without doing a course or a good course. And what ends up happening is nearly 70% of the time, they will just give the answer to a student. So in that case, in that model there, what they're actually doing is just passing on information. They're not teaching at all. And in fact, that research goes on to show that actual qualified people who know about teaching strategies and chunking and those types of things that I'll get to in a minute, will only give answers out around about 11% of the time, which is a massive difference. I think this is a real, what they call in the academic and research world, a seminal study. It's not an actual seminal study, so it's not something that changed the world. But to me, I think that is a really important learning, I guess you could say, especially given that we know that some other research shows that the average teacher, this would apply for coaches, teacher aides, trainers, ask 400 questions a day. So if you're asking that number of questions, and this is all around how dealing with those question sessions, so you might not receive 400 questions, but either way it's going to be a lot. So in that sort of space, or knowing that how much time that takes up, the difference between 70% and 10% has a substantial impact on the ability for those students to be able to learn that content and to acquire and consolidate that content, because all you're doing for pretty much the entire lesson, or all that person who is doing that 68% of the time, is just handing over information like that. They're not actually teaching at all. So that's important to bear in mind. That just popped into my brain. But I've said that in a few videos, but it is an important bit of research that I think everyone should take note of. Now, explicit instruction is, I like to liken explicit instruction to just good old-fashioned teaching. It basically involves very highly structured, you've got lessons, so you've got things like pace, short, sharp activities, lots of momentum, lots of opportunities, so it's called opportunities to respond, which means basically students are the teacher's asking lots of questions and the student will respond really quickly, so they're called opportunities to respond. I like to use a term called opportunities to practice as well, and quite often what happens is there'll be deliberate practice, which is the same thing really, right? So you've got deliberate, which is one of the other strategies actually. So you've got deliberate practice as a part of that. And the most important aspect of explicit instruction is that you're setting goals at the start, and then usually what happens is there'll be little activities of between 2 and 7 minutes or something like that. And there'll be individual work, there'll be pair work, there might be group work, there might be a whole of class activity like a game or some type of feedback discussion-y sort of activity. Highly structured lessons. And even though you might think, oh, highly structured is a lot of work and it's very teacher-centered, there's lots of eyes on the teacher, it's very sort of traditional in that sense. I've actually found that this is one of my more favoured ones when it leads, particularly with kids and particularly with subjects like maths and things like that, where you can go through and do lots of practice activities. And even teaching adults, explicit instruction is used, but just in a very relaxed sort of way. So instead of doing 2-minute activities, you're probably doing 15-minute activities or 10-minute activities or whatnot. So what I don't like to do, and I think the opposite of explicit instruction in many sense, is what I call the set and circulate model. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but you just got to be aware that if you're choosing to do that, there are a lot of cons of it, I guess. There are a lot of problems with that, particularly in the behaviour sense, and particularly in the way of it lacks that momentum, it lacks a lot of excitement, and time, I find, can go quite slow. People who are new to teaching tend to do that set and circulate. They'll do some stuff on the board, and then they'll go and they'll walk around. They'll set a 40-minute activity or something, and then walk around and circulate. And if you're in year 9 or something, you'll spend the entire time just trying to stop students from mucking around and talking and things. Whereas the explicit instruction, so you'll have an average lesson plan, you'll have an intro, some type of bridging to previous learning type thing, some type of link to the previous lesson, and you might do some modelling at the start or some type of instructional type thing at the start, worked examples, for example. You might use some analogies or metaphors or just do your maths questions on the board. You might get the students involved. But either way, you're doing some type of expert modelling at the start, usually some guided learning or shared learning, which is the next two that I'm putting up. And then deliberate practice or some individual work. And you might do some pair work. And there's always like a conclusion type of thing at the start. And it's very goal orientated, and it's very, here are the things today we want to achieve. And let's go do that. And then at the end, you refer back to that and go, did we achieve that? What did we meet and what did we not meet? This is especially good for classes where there are behavioural problems. It's a little bit more difficult at the start, particularly if you're a teacher or you're working with a small group as a teacher aide or whatever. You're used to doing this just by default because there's a natural instinct to think that doing that means you can then circulate and there's less of a stress of having to teach and deal with behaviour at the same time, but in actual fact, it's easier to do explicit instruction. Now, there are other types and other variations and so on and so forth. Like I said, there's lots of opportunities to respond, which are questioning techniques. There's lots of what we call formative assessment, lots of worked examples, and again, I would emphasise that short, sharp activities so you get that pace and momentum. So that's really the two most important things. And another way to sort of do this, instead of like that where you go teacher, individual, pair, small group, whole of class, conclusion, is you can do teacher, everyone else, teacher, everyone else, teacher, everyone else, with lots of opportunities to respond. So it might be, right, let's do question 1. You got 2 minutes, go. And then you give them 2 minutes and then they respond, or you start asking for answers or whatever. They can come on the board and give the answer. You can have a little chat about it for 2 minutes and you go, right, question 2, go. And then they can give you the answers after 2 minutes or 30 seconds or 6 minutes or whatever. And then you go through and you could do some extra examples on the board or whatever. And it'll take you an hour to get through 8 questions as you get good at explicit instruction. So I'd give that a bit of a crack if you've never done it before, because it does work. And I think it's definitely a good way to do teaching, this thing called teaching, whether it's small groups and you're doing remedial things, or even if you're working with a student one-on-one and you're circulating, you're only there for a little bit, because that's the other thing with these teaching strategies is that they are applicable across the board. So if you're working with 3 kids and you're a teacher aide, you're only there for 10 minutes, you can still use explicit instruction or various different versions of it or elements of it, right? But then on the other hand, if you're teaching a whole class, you can still use various different elements of explicit instruction. You don't have to use it. Remember, we're not using any of these strategies in a sort of a purist, ideological, almost like a religious zealot type thing. We're just thinking about, well, this is pretty good. We like using this in most instances, depending on what we're teaching. But if you're teaching year one, even in primary, even in when childcare centres and things, they still use explicit instruction, particularly for phonics and things like that. But then they'll do a lot of play-based type constructivist work as well. So they're using a combination of different teaching strategies that are, some are traditional, some are not so traditional and whatnot. Anyway, so we'll move on from explicit instruction. Again, watch a video of that. Now I'll do guided learning. I've done these around the wrong way, but that doesn't matter. And shared learning. I always do these around the wrong way. Maybe because it's alphabetically G becomes for S, I don't know. But guided learning and shared learning, I was thinking about putting them together, but they're probably important enough that we can pull them out apart. And we'll do, should we do modelling? Okay, let's do modelling. Modelling / worked examples. Yeah. Okay, so the basics of guided learning and shared learning, again, watch my video about that. I put them all together in one video. Modelling was a separate one. These basically are, these have come from the literacy type world, but they are used across the board, or at least I use them across the board because I think they're relevant to all different subjects. The other thing about a lot of these strategies too, by the way, is your more experienced teachers, teacher aides, coaches, trainers, they'll use a lot of these even though they don't actually know that they're things or that they're names or that they're concepts or whatnot. So particularly elements of explicit instruction and particularly elements of these are the types of things that people are using naturally, but it takes 15, 20 years worth of experience to get to the point where they finally figure out, well not finally figured out, but gradually figure out what is the most effective way of teaching. So by putting these on the board and by pointing out that this is an actual strategy and here's what it can look like for you, and here's what other people do, and here's what the definitions of this, and it means that we don't have to wait 20 years and do 20 years worth of trial and error and that kind of stuff to start thinking about what best practice teaching looks like. But a lot of more experienced teachers, a lot of these things come from when researchers go out into schools, particularly in the 70s and 80s and to an extent 90s, but particularly in the 70s and 80s, they went out into schools and they were observing teachers because at that stage the research community was quite young and everyone was really trying to figure out, so what does best teaching look like? There weren't books about, well there weren't really any, I guess, popular books about this is how to teach and so forth. And of course, post-World War II, classrooms were changing quite rapidly from pre-World War II as well and the way they used to operate and things. So that process kind of happened in the research community, and this is where a lot of these terms started evolving from. Like scaffolding is not a new term whatsoever, and it's one of the more important strategies. And even some of the other ones that I talk about a lot, like the zone of proximal development, that's been around for a good 100 years or so. So none of these are necessarily new. Anyway, okay, so guided and shared learning, let's get through some a bit quicker. So guided learning, we'll start with shared because that's where it starts. So shared learning is where the teacher is doing, say, 50% and the student is doing 50%. Generally, it means the teacher or teacher aide will be doing the hard aspects of a particular strategy as opposed to, of a strategy of a task. So if a task has say a task has 4 different sections, then the teacher might do that one, and then the student does those 2 because those are the hardest aspect of it. So you can apply that to pretty much anything. Quite often we do shared learning on the board, so the teacher might write the first half of a paragraph, or they might help if you're structuring out an essay. They may do bits of it and students have to sort of fill in the gaps. If you're doing a maths problem, that's pretty obvious. The teacher will do half of it. But the point is with shared learning is that it's shared, so the teacher's actually doing part of the problem for the student to help them go about doing it. And obviously over time we're doing less and less there's less and less of an emphasis on the teacher doing that activity and more of an emphasis or more opportunities for the actual student to do it. So to the point where eventually the student's doing it 100% of the time, and that's where the whole guided learning thing comes in. So guided learning basically means that the teacher's still there, the teacher aide's there, so there's still that more knowledgeable person that's helping the student and overseeing the process, but they're not actually doing any of it per se. And in reality, again, these two, I do like to put them together because, well, they are related because it's a part of that sequence, the levels of instruction, as it's quite often called, that actually starts down here, so I've done it in complete reverse order. But they are related and they can be mixed up together. So even though I'm doing guided learning now, I don't want to actually do any of it, but I can help the student if they have sort of problems. But I'm going to do 0 of it for them. And remember that thing that I was saying before about that 68%. So just bear that in mind. So with shared learning, you can probably give them the answer 50% of the time or 25% of the time or whatever. But with guided learning, it's 0, ideally. In actual fact, it won't be 0. Let's say 0 to 10 because, again, we're not being zealots about this type of thing. So you can see that from that discussion we had about that teachers and teacher aides are spending a huge amount of time doing actual guided learning when they're quite experienced and when they know what they're doing. But when they're inexperienced, so your parent helpers who just come in, you sort of, just help out, don't understand any of the strategies, they're using more so, I guess, their version of shared learning. But they're not actually sharing it per se as much as they're just giving the answers to students. But so that's the difference there anyway. And a little side note that's quite interesting. Now, the first thing that normally happens in an explicit classroom or explicit instruction classroom is some type of modelling or worked example. And that's sort of like what I'm doing here. So if you were doing maths or Venn diagrams, you would draw it on the board, explain bits and pieces of it, and so on and so forth. So that's the basics of modelling. It's just explaining how to do something. Usually you will use what is known as a think aloud, which we can add up there. And a think aloud goes along with a worked example. So a worked example may or may not. Usually you do that one section at a time so students can see what happens. But a think aloud is not only modelling, but it also gives the teacher, whoever's doing the teaching, the opportunity to explain to students how to go about doing that task in a certain way. So they might divide a task into different steps and they're going through and explaining the mental processes that an expert goes through as they're completing that task. What different options do I have? What could go wrong? What do I have to be careful of? Why am I doing it in this way? Why is it important to pay particular attention here? But then over here you can sort of, just quickly do it. What are the other little tricks and things that you've learnt along the way? So that's the think aloud. Think aloud's just, it's probably not the best term in the sense that you're not really just thinking aloud. It's more like an explain aloud. Think and explain aloud. So it's slightly different because experts have a level of automation and they combine multiple steps together and they skip steps and stuff like that. So they're not actually thinking about a lot of these things. They still think as they're going, obviously, but their inner voice isn't saying, right, okay, I can do this or I can do that. I'm going to do it this way and this is why. I've got to be careful that I don't do this. They may do a little bit of that, but not to the same level and extent that we would do in a think aloud so that students can understand and see the actual process or hear the actual process, I guess you could say. So I'm going to add scaffolding in here. Or scaffolds. No, I won't do that. Scaffolding. Scaffolding or scaffolds, if you want to use the noun, basically is ways of helping a student, Scaffolding I like to think of is another word for teaching in many respects. It's another word for strategy as well. So you can think of it like that. Scaffolding is a way of teaching and dividing up a task and providing resources and providing different ways for the student to access that information. So some examples you'll see online, scaffolding is sort of like a stairway, and so that's basically chunking, or another strategy that we call that is called elaboration. So that's a stairway and the person is sort of walking up the steps one bit at a time. So that's effectively a type of chunking because you're just dividing the task into 6 different steps. Another way that people demonstrate scaffolding is you've got a building of sorts and you've literally got scaffolds around the outside that helps hold that building up as they're doing a task. And then over time, you're slowly taking those scaffolds away until the building can stand on its own. So that's another sort of metaphor. Scaffolding is not an actual task or activity per se. It's almost an umbrella concept that means all of these other things as well. All of these different, it means that we help students learn something by doing some different strategies and doing some different resources and putting different processes in place. So that's why I like to think of scaffolding as almost like a synonym for teaching strategies, because using multiple teaching strategies, methods, approaches, resources, so on and so forth. That's what scaffolding means. And quite often people don't talk of scaffolding, they talk of scaffolds. So they'll say, okay, so we're going to use a bunch of scaffolds to help teach this particular process. And what they're saying is they're dividing it into steps. Or they're providing resources, a resource here like a worksheet, a resource here and whatnot. So all of these are scaffolds. Probably not that one, probably not that one. But this is a scaffold, guided learning. So, and shared learning is a scaffold. And modelling is definitely yeah, we'll go with that. Think Aloud is definitely a scaffold. So there are ways of helping students to learn something. So cool. All right, we'll rub that off. Then we will get cranking. Oh, and that's the other one. I kind of chunking. Let's just write first 10, eh? Okay, so the next three, scaffolding is somewhat related to scaffolding. Chunking is somewhat related to scaffolding. So quite often I just combine them, but scaffolding is basically, chunking is basically dividing something into different tasks. So it can be a memory task. You divide it into, if they've got to remember 20 things, you divide it into 5, 5, 5 and 5, for example. But in the education sector, we talk about chunking as in dividing sections of knowledge up into, or sections of concepts or understanding or whatever into certain chunks to make it easier for students to understand. So if you are teaching kids phonics, for example, then you might be teaching just A, I, E, O, U. So that's where you might start. You're not teaching all 26 letters and numbers and words or whatever. You're dividing it up into, to do that first, and then the week after you might do something different or whatever. If you're teaching or you want students to learn how to do, I don't know, if they're learning some type of maths problem, let's say graphs, because that's the example I always go with. On this lesson here, so this is lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. This one here, we might do this type of graph, a bar, a pie chart, whatever it is. This one, we might do the trend graph. And then over here, we might do a bar chart type of thing. So again, you're dividing these things into just different ways of doing something. And the overall goal at the start might have been something like use graphs and tables or something like that. So yeah, use graphs and tables. And then of course, you then chunk it down into little sections and you further chunk these down again. So you can chunk that down as how do I do one of those? There's say 6 or 7 processes that you can go through there. Chunking works for everything, whether you're training up a new staff member, teaching surgery, teaching how to build a bridge, teaching phonics. Chunking's really important for every single thing that we do in education. Now I'm going to get through metacognitive skills really quickly because I talk about that a lot in every video. So if you've watched more than one video, you're probably already half an expert at metacognitive skills. And I've done a specific video on it that's quite thorough. Metacognitive skills basically means thinking about thinking. And if we're teaching students all these strategies, one thing that we can also do, or that high-performing teachers and teacher aides and coaches and that do, is teach those students not just the content and not just the skills or the knowledge or whatever it is that we have as our goals for that particular learning sequence, but we're also teaching them how to become lifelong learners themselves. So how can they learn? How can they be self-directed learners when we're not around? So that's metacognitive skills. And even if you're in a class, say you're in a class of 30 kids, if you teach those kids metacognitive skills and you start at the beginning of the year, by the end of the year they've acquired say 5 or 10 metacognitive skills, what that means is that even when you're not standing with these two students trying to help them, you're over with those two students on the other side of the class, they can use metacognitive skills to help themselves learn. So some of the most common metacognitive skills include chunking. One of my favourite one is proceduralization. I call it proceduralization, and it's from a cognitivist type teaching, cognitivist type methodology, I guess. And proceduralization basically means you just make procedures. In cognitivism, it's called standardization. So your standardization, and there's one other word. Anyway, but it basically means that you, for all the different tasks that you do some type of cognitive task analysis, and you're dividing that task into multiple steps. And then you're able to apply those multiple steps to any other task of a similar, or even not so similar, but there are some links type of relationship there. And so if you can teach kids how to divide maths questions into different steps, and then learn how to apply those universal steps to other maths problems of a similar nature, like graphs or whatever, then they can just follow those procedures. So that's one example of metacognitive skills. Have a look at metacognitive skills and the video there. There's a whole bunch of them. There's probably 10 or 12. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to teach students to do is to be able to learn themselves, not just to learn the information right in front of them. So that's what we mean by metacognitive skills. And I use it as a broad term. I don't use it. Technically, there is a difference between metacognitive skills, meta-learning, cognitive skills, etc. I don't care about any of that. I just use the word metacognitive skills. So, differentiation. Differentiation basically means that we do stuff away from the norm. So, let's say the best way to show you this is that if we have a lesson plan there, then either side of that, so lesson plan, and that's aimed at the mean, what would I say? Mean skill level. Yeah, so the mean, so average, let's say skill level for this particular thing. Average, so it's aimed at the mean skill level of the class, or the average skill level of the class. One standard deviation, I guess you could say. So it's aimed at the about 65% of students will fall into that lesson plan quite neatly, quite easily. But what about the students on either side? So what about the students that are over here? So this is, you'll say 65% of students in a 30-student class is 19 and a half students or whatever. So let's say you've got say 20 students there, but you're going to have 3 or 4 over here who are doing really good. There's your accelerator students, and you're going to have ones over here who are struggling. So you might have 6 or 7 or something over there. I think I probably drew too many dots, but now what happens here is that we need to differentiate. So we plan for the masses, as I like to call it, which sounds horrible, but that's just what we do. You can't have a lesson plan for every student unless you're in a special needs type thing, in which case you can. But generally speaking, we plan for the masses, and then we differentiate out in those different directions. Most people only differentiate in this direction, so they're helping out students that are struggling, or they're not integrating as well as we would like because of a disability or whatever. Well, that's not the right way to say it. They're not able to integrate as easily without our support. So we're integrating in that direction, in the direction of where students are struggling. But I think ethically we should also differentiate in the other direction as well, because we are in a developmental curriculum, and what that means is that every student has the right to develop. That's literally the definition of a developmental curriculum. Okay, the one other thing I will say about that before moving on, because I do have a video on differentiation, but one thing I didn't say in that is that a lot of these strategies are actually differentiation tools. So if you've seen, so one of them is learning styles, which is that VAC model, right? That's just a different video. So learning styles is just a different way of categorizing students into, I like to call them preferred learning styles, because they're not actually learning styles. The research quite clearly shows that this just doesn't work. People have preferred learning styles, which is different to what they learn most effectively at. Now, what that means is that some students are better learning visually, some auditory, and some kinesthetic or tactile, in tactile sort of ways, by touching things, playing with things, fixing things and that kind of stuff. So that's one way of differentiating between students. Another way is the multiple intelligences. Again, I've got a video on that, so watch that one. What's another one? There is another thing called Bloom's Taxonomy, which is a way of framing questions or cognitive, I guess it's cognitive abilities and cognitive questions and cognitive understanding at various different levels, from the very basic of just understanding a key fact right through to be able to create, evaluate, analyse new information and knowledge and make links between different concepts and things like that. So it's called a taxonomy, which is a stupid name, but really it's just a hierarchy of, I don't want to use the word cognitive, but yeah, cognitive abilities, I guess, from the very basic. And we use this, 99% of the time teachers use this for developing questions, whether it's assessment questions or just talking to students. But either way, that's another, these are just different ways of differentiating. So changing what we're doing, either changing our strategies, changing how we apply that strategy, or changing our resources specifically for one student or two students or a small group of students or whatever. So we've got to make slight adjustments. And that's what differentiation just means. It just means that we're making adjustments. So teachers are constantly looking, teacher aides, whatever, to make those adjustments to help students. And you do it naturally anyway. If you're walking around and these students need help, you're going to differentiate by changing up the way in which they're doing a particular question. You might use different inputs. You might go back to using a worked example / model and change the direction and the goals of the lesson for that particular student or that group of students. So yeah, differentiation is just doing something different for different students. That's the simplest and easiest way of understanding that. Okay, so that's our first 10. These aren't a top 10 or anything like that. They're just the most obvious 10 that I think we can begin with. Very relatively simple. There's nothing crazy in any of those that anyone would really disagree with. There are some other, obviously we'll go through a few more now and I'll get through them a little bit quicker, I promise. But you know, I think if you know those top 10 there, I don't want to call them the top 10, but if you're aware of those 10 and this is the first time you're really talking or thinking about teaching strategies, then I think you've got plenty of things to practice to get you started anyway. Now I'm going to just deliberate practice is the next one I'd like to put up because, again, deliberate practice kind of relates to explicit instruction, but it's more so thought of in terms of working with kids or working with anyone really, but going through and giving them the old school traditional practice this 10 times type thing. So I'm also going to put up spaced learning. Now, I did a video on both of these. Deliberate practice, by the way, is also... Deliberate practice is most commonly associated, if you look it up, people talk about sports people. So it's a professional golfer learning, sitting there or standing there and practicing every little aspect of their swing. They're not just going about playing golf 100 times a week. They're actually practicing specific aspects, practicing their knees and their hips and filming it and looking at it and getting advice and all this kind of stuff. So that's deliberate practice. Very, very effective. If you're teaching anything that's gross motor or fine motor, you need to know about deliberate practice, and it's also called purposeful practice. Space learning is kind of related because it's come from that sort of physical, phys ed, sport, that kind of learning skills type of thing. But both of these are applicable in every class, maths, science, whatever, English. Space learning is the idea that over time, as you learn things, it's more effective from a physiological point of view in the brain if you learn things over time as opposed to mass practice, which can still be used, but mass practice means you're just doing 8 hours of practice or learning something in one day for 8 hours is nowhere near as effective as dividing that 8 hours into twice a week over 4 weeks. So that's basically what space learning is about. It's also based in there's a few different neurological type theories around that and how that works, but basically you've got your working memory, or say your short-term memory, you've got your long-term memory, and the more often that we put information from short-term to long-term, and more so, the more times we have to recall it, so we have to retrieve it, from long term, the stronger those connections become. So that's the sort of basic theory behind short space learning. And if that's all you know about space learning, then that's all you really need to know about space learning. But just be aware that it is effective. And we do a lot of other strategies called reviews, for example. So if you're doing a lesson plan that goes over a period of, well, lesson plan, if you're doing a course that goes over 16 weeks or 2 semesters or something like that, then doing regular reviews throughout there, even for 2 minutes, takes advantage of that space learning and really helps students. I mean, if you look at a Year 11 class, they have 4 terms. So 4 terms, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they have their final exam here. They usually have a couple of exams there, one in the middle. Now, if they're studying something there, 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 something there. Now, you study that and do a test, never revisit it again. They do a bit of an exam here, and you do a little bit of a revision or whatever. That information there, well, let's say that's just a basic intro one. So let's say this second one, they're not going to really remember much here. And maybe they will, but they're really going to struggle compared to these ones, right? So the best way to teach this is somehow here, just do a little 2-minute review on that and that and that, and then do another one here where you're just choosing something to review and doing it there, or even an aspect of it. So you're doing these regular reviews throughout. And by doing that, one, you're taking advantage of space learning in the actual physical way in which the brain grows and maintains its strength as far as being able to mentally be able to do things and recall things and so on. But you're also able to fill gaps. So if this one's easy and students are 100% there, then you do a little review here on that first one and it takes 2 minutes, that one for 3 minutes. But this one, students are really struggling on most of it. Well, you could spend 10 minutes on it there. You could do a little bit of flipped learning and a little bit of extra homework or whatever. And I think this is where teachers really fall down because they're not doing a backward design type process or a top-down process. Is because they do stuff here and that's pretty much it. There's no formal process for doing reviews. And that's really, really important. This applies if you're learning how to fly planes, if you're learning how to drive a car, if you're learning how to do surgery, if you're learning how to do phonics, if you're doing anything. If you're teaching kids in year 2, then what you're teaching here, you've got to make sure that, yes, that's embedded throughout, right? But you're also doing these regular reviews to really consolidate it. So anyway, that is the basics of spaced learning and deliberate practice as we know it to be. Let's use a different colour because we're going to change tack here. 1-on-1 instruction. Nope. This pen is going dead. Let's try purple. Okay, cool. Yeah. So, just a couple of extra ones. I do have a video on one-on-one instruction. I highly recommend watching that because it's very important because we all do lots of one-on-one instruction and it's been something that's been around for decades is this idea that one-on-one instruction is very effective or one-on-one tutoring or whatever because you're one-on-one with the student. There's lots of different reasons for why one-on-one is very important. So go and watch that one and I think you will definitely learn something from that video, particularly what I like to call the treatment loop. So the treatment loop goes like this. Basically here you've got a student and there are specific problems or you need to identify the specific problem that they're having. The example I always use is reading, so making sure that if a student says, I have problems with reading, or whoever says, this student is having problems with reading, can you help them learn how to read? Then you're looking at accurately diagnosing what the issue is because it's not reading. It's not the maths question. It's not playing this sport or whatever. There are specific things within that problem they've got. Remember that diagram we were doing where it was like this? There's like 10 different steps in creating a simple little graph like that, right? 10, you could divide that up into 20 steps. They may be able to do 90% of that, but they just have problems with putting the little dots in. Or they might have problems with that bit, or they might have problems with this bit because it's English-based or whatever. So in that case, then, I don't want to rub that off. I'll rub this one off. in that case, if you can identify specifically what that problem is, then you can treat it. So you can have a treatment, and from the treatment, and there's a few different ways that I draw this. I draw it differently every time. But after you've gone through and treated it and the student has time to practice, then they can practice and you can see, have I solved that problem now? Otherwise, you can provide more feedback or more formative assessment and more feedback. And again, then there's that opportunities to practice. And so forth. So it's a bit of a cycle. There's a few different ways that I like to draw that, but the one that I've done on that particular video was a lot more thorough, so I'd definitely watch that one. But the most important part is that diagnosis and that treatment. They're the two parts that are the most important. So yeah, I would definitely watch that one. As far as what I like to, I don't think I necessarily consider it to be the only way to do one-on-one instruction, but I think it's important to think about if you're going to go help a person one-on-one, and one-on-one is defined as 1-on-2, 1-on-3, it doesn't really matter, but it's not 1-on-10. If you're going to go help students one-on-one, what is best practice? In 1 or 2 sentences, define best practice. So have a think about that. As with everything we do, we want to make sure that we are using best practice. Now, next thing I want to talk about is graphic organisers, which is just a different way of, on paper, usually on paper, 90% of the time, helping students to organise information in certain ways. So they're called graphic organisers. KWL charts, for example, any type of graphs that you do on the board, or any type of graphic interface that students can use to figure information out, or organise information. You can make these up yourself. One of the examples in the video I did of that is where you've got a person who's a character in a book, and the students have to write information about that character around the outside. So that's just known as a graphic organiser. Well, that's one type of graphic organiser. There's millions of those. It's a type of scaffolding, right? So what ends up happening is if you want students to learn about a book or something like that, or say a short story, then you need some way of organising that information so that you can help the student. You need some way of organising that information, or organising the way in which students approach that information or that text, so that they can make sense of that information and they can figure out what's important, what's not important, and it directs their learning. So they're different types of graphic organisers. There's lots of different types of those. The Venn diagrams that I use quite regularly in examples, where you've got things in there, that's a different type of graphic organiser. And number 15 is building rapport. Now, rapport is really important because it kind of actually belongs in the other basket because I divide everything I teach into really 2 baskets, probably 3. But one is teaching strategies, one is behaviour, and one is that operational or logistical side of things. But I sort of think building rapport belongs across the board. I've always put it under the teaching strategies section, but it could just as well go under the behaviour management. But anyway, that doesn't really matter. Rapport basically means you're developing a positive relationship with students, or with your students and with your colleagues as well, but mainly your students. And the reason for that is the research is very, very clear on this. There is no arguing it. No one in the world will argue it. You cannot learn from someone that you don't like. And the more that students like you, the more that they're going to behave, the more motivated that they're going to be, the more they're going to want to be in class, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of different ways that you can go about building rapport with students. Some people just have a natural knack for it and they got a personality and whatever, but there are some specific ways that we can go about building rapport and some techniques. So I go through those in the video on that one. I went through, I don't know, probably 5 or 6. Things like just having a chat with students as you circulate, greeting them at the door, trying to make that connection, giving them, like for example, what'd you do on the weekend? Oh, I went and played soccer. Oh, okay, I used to play soccer. What position do you play? So in that way, you're building rapport with them. Okay, so that's number 15, rapport. Welcome back, everyone. I magically moved to the other side of the whiteboard. Sorry about that interruption. On these longer videos, I've had issues in the past with my card being full and my battery running out or whatnot. So at about an hour, I like to stop and to move on. And to refresh my technology powers and storage space and whatever. Okay, so we've gone through 15 so far. I'm not going to recap those, obviously. Building rapport. Again, rapport just means relationship, but in a professional kind of sense. Number 16 is questioning skills. or techniques, whatever you want to call it. I like to use the word, I like to use this as an actual strategy per se in this, again, how I categorize these things and whether they're strategies or techniques or skills or whatever, who cares? There's something that we spend a huge amount of time doing. Therefore, we should think about them and think about what best practice is. So, I just chuck them all in there. And some of these things are approaches to teaching or more... I'd call that an approach to teaching, a way of going about that process of teaching, whereas other things in here are more like this is an actual activity, this is more like a concept, chunking's more of a planning thing, metacognitive skills is more of a secondary priority, so they're all very different ways of going about this complex thing called teaching or facilitating or training or whatever you're doing. So questioning skills, again, I've got a video about that, so please watch that. The questioning skills section video actually is really important because of the sheer volume of questions that we ask students and that we get asked and the type of feed. It's not only just asking the questions, but it's being able to respond to their responses as well. So, for example, some of the basic things off the top of my head, one of them is wait time. And if you haven't heard of wait time, you desperately need to watch that video because wait time is sort of teaching 101 type of thing. It's super important. And I even see uni lecturers doing this wrong, where they're wait time basically means that you ask a question, but you're not choosing who you're going to require to provide a response, because then if you do that, only that person is going to think of the answer. So what you do is you ask the question, you have a bit of wait time, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, whatever it is. Every student then needs to come up with the answer, and then you choose someone. So anyway, that's called wait time. Yeah, it's very basic. Obviously there's phraseology, or the way in which it's phrased. So I like to just say simple and clear. So there are various different ways in which you can phrase questions. There's also other different little strategies such as bounce, B-O-U-N-C-E, and so forth. So watch the questioning skills video. Rapid fire questioning is a really good little activity that you can do with students. And just remember that research we were going through before about the number of questions that teachers ask in a day, which is 400, 120 an hour or something. I think they were saying in that. And that worked out to be, I think that was in a middle school class, but I'm not 100% sure. And it was a US thing. And it was, I think I did the maths on this once, and it worked out to be something like 70,000 questions a year if you're doing 40 weeks of teaching. I could be wrong. But regardless of that, it doesn't matter if that's true or who knows. Regardless, we spend a ton of time doing questioning skills. So if you're going into a classroom and you know quite a few different strategies, but you're not feeling that you've mastered questioning skills as far as something that, if you don't feel that you've mastered questioning skills and all the little bits and pieces that I've outlined either in my book or the blog or on the actual video that I've done of that one, they sort of are all the same thing really, then you're not getting the most out of a lot of these other things. Explicit instruction involves questioning skills. Guided and shared learning definitely involves questioning skills. Differentiation does, certainly metacognitive skills, because there's self-questioning and so on and so forth. So scaffolding definitely does. Whenever we go through and do think alouds, we're almost always asking questions to check for understanding. So it's one of those things that are just found everywhere. Throughout the day, you're doing tons of it. The same as building rapport, the same as one-on-one instruction, you're doing lots of it non-stop. So it's important to really think about, well, you think if you were an accountant or if you were a lawyer or a pilot or whatever, if there was something that you did 400 times a day, you'd probably hope that that person was an expert in that particular thing, particularly if you were paying for those services. So just think of it like that. I would really encourage you to go Google around for a bit and watch my video on questioning skills. It might be called questioning techniques. I can't remember. It doesn't really matter anyway. So yeah, that's number 16. Number 17 is formative assessment. Sort of related. I'm going to have to rub that off, sorry. Number 18 is feedback. Number 19, I'm going to go with building on existing knowledge because I should have already done that. And then we'll go phonics, I think. And then we're going to go phonics. I'll write a couple up now. And then I hope we can read number 21 and number 22. Writing skills. And number 22. Maybe I should have written this up on the break. Language and literacy continuum. Horrible word to spell. Okay, so that's the next few. So just quickly, we'll get through this relatively quick. Formative assessment. Again, I've done videos on every single one of these. The formative assessment is basically informal assessment. So that's about using your questioning skills or any other strategy to figure out where the students are meeting their goals. So if you say at the start of the lesson, this is what we want to go about achieving this lesson, you need to be constantly figuring out whether you're heading in the right direction or whether your students are heading in the right direction. So you're checking whether they're confused, you're checking whether they understand what they're supposed to be doing, you're trying to find gaps in their knowledge and understanding. There's lots of different ways you can go about doing that. That's known as formative assessment. So something that's a big buzzword at the moment, well, I'm guessing across the world, but particularly in OECD countries, formative assessment is a big thing. In Australia, New Zealand, I start to see lots of PDs and things coming out around that formative assessment area. Basically, it's the opposite of summative assessment, and formative assessment also includes, that's not the diagram I had before. Formative assessment includes, that circle that I did where it had the diagnosis, treatment, feedback, and so on and so forth. One of them was formative assessment, but that activity at the top there where it was diagnosis, and that's one-on-one instruction, is a type of formative assessment. So that will confuse you a little bit if you've never heard this term before, because you would naturally think that diagnostic assessments or diagnostic tests were actually summative, but in actual fact they're formative. Even though I like to think of formative as informal, but it's not actually quite true. Formative assessment basically means that we're checking on progress and gaps and things like that so that we can provide feedback, so that we can differentiate, so that we can change how we're doing things, so we can do different strategies and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's formative assessment. That's why diagnostic assessments or diagnostic tests fit into that category, because the summative ones just summarise what we've learned so far, and then that's it. Then you move on to something completely different. Now, feedback's obviously very important. Again, watch the video on that. Feedback is the way in which we go about providing information to students so that they can improve. That can involve error correction, but that's usually, it's not bad practice, but it's not fantastic practice. Error correction is something that novice people who are not trained or haven't watched these type of videos, error correction is something that people quite often do, but in actual fact that's not that important. What's important is understanding the concepts behind what they're actually doing. So if they're learning how to write a short story, spelling a couple of words wrong, I would just ignore it. I'd almost completely ignore it. I might not. I spell words wrong. Even in these videos I spell them wrong all the time. Who really cares? Yes, it's important to learn how to spell and all literacy and all that kind of stuff. Actually, that's language, not literacy. But what is the goal? So what goal have you got for that particular lesson? If it's to learn how to write short stories and to do some character development and to think about the way in which imagery works, or how to describe a setting or something like that, that is what you are marking against as far as the feedback goes. So anyway, there are some hints and tips that are actually very important in that feedback video. Have a look at that. Really, and for me, I really emphasise the metacognitive skills when I'm talking about providing feedback as well, because if we just give students the answer and do a bit of error correction, I mean, are they going to remember it? Is it really going to help? Probably not. But how about we teach them how to learn on their own when we're not standing over their shoulder? How about we teach them the skills and processes to be able to go and read more difficult texts or write longer short stories or whatever, and they'll pick up the spelling as they go. So it's not to say that we can't concentrate on that, but it is not the be-all and end-all. So there's a lot to feedback. I would definitely be looking at that. And that's why I sort of put it around here. Probably should have gone formative assessment, then questioning skills, then feedback. Part of formative assessment, and a very important part, is questioning skills. And then from that, we then provide feedback to students. I added this one in just then, building on existing knowledge. I probably should have done that further up there somewhere because my gut instinct is that this is what we do at the start of lessons or start of any activities, or even if you're going to help this student here. Let's say you help this student for even 2 minutes. One of the first things we do, remember that thing where we were doing that diagnosis in the one-on-one instruction activity. We do that. This is what I call the one-on-one treatment loop, because we diagnose something, then we treat it. Now, to be able to treat it, we have to diagnose it. The part of that diagnosis is knowing exactly where they're at. And then we can build on it. That's one way to think of that particular concept. Building on existing knowledge is also happens as far as differentiation is concerned. Also, when we're doing planning and we're going about doing various different planning activities, we're thinking about where students start. So again, watch that video, because there is this false assumption that students come into a lesson and know nothing. Whether you're teaching adults, whether you're teaching, whatever you're teaching, it doesn't matter. Students never come in. Sometimes they come in with the wrong information and misconceptions and things like that. But that's where your starting point should be. Your starting point and your assumption is not zero. Even if you're getting kids in pre-primary or kindy or year one or whatever, and you're like, okay, I need to teach phonics. They're not starting at zero. They've had 3, 4, 5 years or whatever it is of exposure. They already have something of a vocabulary. They already play with blocks that have got letters and sounds on them and things like that. They already have some type of understanding that to communicate and get things, you need to use words and so forth. So they come in with heaps of information. The example I was using before, just quickly on building on existing knowledge, because I think it's an area that gets ignored a lot, even by professional curriculum developers and I guess instructional designers, which is a probably more appropriate term for those that are spending their time doing planning. Even if we're looking at that example we went before with the graphs, students know what that means. They know what a graph is. Even probably a year 3 student will know that's a graph. They might not know how to read it or whatever, but they'll still have an idea about what it is. What's it used for? They'll know that adults use it for finance and money and things or whatever. So they've still got some ideas, and then you can build on that. And they might know that describes that line there, for example. They might know that a title already goes there. So if you're going into a maths class in, say, year 5 to teach this, and there are 7 things there, because remember we proceduralise, standardise everything. And we've decided that there are 6 different steps here. We've chunked it down, and now you're going to add a scaffold to it, right? And the scaffold is to say, now we're going to, this is a scaffold, I guess. You're doing some type of worked example with them. What I meant to say was we're taking advantage of this building on existing knowledge strategy by saying, okay, well, you know that, this is where we need help. And even then, what do you know about this? So they might have problems with that, but they'll still know that they're dots, and they'll still know in their own way, they might not be able to articulate it, that it represents something, that it's information. So they'll know quite a few different things, and you can use your questioning skills to try and tease that information out. So that's building on existing knowledge. And again, I'm going through these various different strategies that I do 40 to 60 minute lectures on, a lot of them. I'm explaining in 30 seconds, so you're not going to get the full gamut of information that I think is really important, but you just get a bit of an intro to get you going, and then you can direct your attention after this video in whichever direction you want to direct it in. So where are we up to? So that's building on existing knowledge. Also goes by lots of different names, as with a lot of these things do. Now, there's a bit of a departure here. 2021-22 moves in the direction specifically of literacy and critical, what's called critical literacy, but in that language and literacy area. So phonics and phonological awareness is all about letters and sounds. I did a very thorough video on that, so please watch that. And that's really what the important building blocks of those early childhood years are, is phonics. And if students are doing any type of remedial instruction or intervention, well, remedial instruction is a sort of the one type of intervention, then usually it's around that phonics area or number sense and things like that, but generally in that phonics. And I say phonics, when I talk about phonics, I also mean whole word and sight words, high utility words, and so forth. So I won't talk about phonics anymore because it is kind of a specialised area, But even if you're teaching in high school, you do need to know a little bit about phonics because it is still relevant. If you're working with English as a second language students, if you're working with... I used to teach a lot of kids that came over from other countries like Somalia and all this kind of stuff. And of course, so you're teaching phonics sometimes to year 11 students. So to... and then you've got writing skills comes next. Now, the interesting thing about writing skills, I put these together because phonics and phonological awareness is a well-known area that you're not going to have any problems finding information about. There is a hierarchy of skills, phonological skills, I guess you could call them, or stages that students go through as they become more familiar with how sounds and letters and words and sentences and things like that work, which I've gone through in that one. In the writing skills one, I haven't done that, but I've based that lecture there around what good spellers do, what good readers do, what good, I guess grammaticians isn't the right word, what good students do who know how to write. What do those students do? So what are the things, and I suppose the easiest way to explain it is what do good spellers do, and the types of metacognitive skills that they use to be able to develop their writing skills and their spelling skills and their reading skills. Now, there is a high correlation between writing skills and reading skills, by the way. So if you're teaching reading, you know that they are naturally at the same time learning how to write. If you're teaching writing, they're learning how to read. And there are high correlations between other subjects, obviously like maths and science, although not to the extent that you would think. But there's also a high correlation between a lot of subjects that you wouldn't think are related. So there is actually a high correlation between writing, not a high correlation, but something of a correlation between writing skills and maths, for example. And a lot of maths is based in English language, or in language if you're doing it in another language, I guess. So a lot of maths involves English type problems and things like that. So and the correlation, I can't remember what it was, it's been a couple of years since I was reading about that, but I think the correlation between reading and writing is something like 0.8, bearing in mind that a perfect correlation of 1.0 means that if your writing skills increase by 10%, your reading skills increase by 10%. That's not mathematically true or correct, but just to serve as an example, as one increases, the other one equally increases. I think some of the other areas like maths and something, I think the correlation is probably 0.2 or whatever, which is still a correlation, still a strong correlation, because there are a lot of correlations out there that are negative, not so much in the education world, but if you know anything about finance or whatever, you know there are negative correlations and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so anyway, that's writing skills. That one's relatively important. If you're watching this area, then I would watch all three of those videos because they are important. The language literacy curriculum is kind of like phonics. It continues on from phonics. So those writing skills float in there. They're just important for everyone, whether you're maths, science, whatever. But the language and literacy continuum is something that, as an English teacher, I used to do a lot, although I spent a lot of time teaching lots of other things, careers, maths, phys ed, primary school, whatever. So, but I found that language and literacy continuum is something that's really good that continues on from phonics. So play around with that one. That actually includes, I think it was 17 different strategies in that one. So strategies per se. So for example, you've got, it ends with critical literacy because that's our ultimate goal, is to not just teach kids how to play with sounds and spell words correctly, but also to be able to interact with the world at a higher sort of level so that they don't get ripped off by scams. They can do contracts, they can create texts and things like that. So we end with critical literacy and throughout there's a bunch of different stages that we go through. For example, they can compare and contrast, and they can summarise and synthesise, and they can do a thing. Active reading is a really good one. Active reading. If you've worked in primary school classes, you would have heard of repeated reading and rereading. Slightly different things, but very important skills to know for, again, all subjects. If you're teaching maths to kids in year 11, you need to know about these things. Particularly active reading, because that comes in handy if you're doing maths-based problems. Maybe not repeated reading, but rereadings are definitely... Repeated reading is where you're just reading over something, a paragraph or whatever, to make sure that you get the pronunciation and stuff right. So you don't really need to know much about that if you're in year 11 maths or anything, or even year 6 maths. But rereading and active reading, rereading in particular, you're reading over a maths question, then you want to be able to understand that question properly before you start answering it, because I would think that a good 10% of marks in an exam or a test for any student at any grade is lost because they don't understand or they don't read the question or they don't think about the question properly. They're metacognitive skills. Rereading is a type of metacognitive skill that you can get students to do. It's more like a cognitive skill, but I class it in that area. Active reading is a way of directing your learning, directing your attention when you're reading something, looking for specific details, and so forth. So again, a metacognitive skill, a process you can teach students, a process that you go through to develop students' knowledge and understanding of different types of texts and genres and so on and so forth. So anyway, I would have a look at that language and literacy curriculum. And do we have room here to do a couple more? I'm going to go crazy and try and use a pink pen. So, hopefully you can see that. Now, one that we haven't done, what are you up to? 23. Backward design and designing down. Sorry if you can't read that, hopefully you can. Backward design and designing down, I won't use that pen again, is the next one off the list. Let's go brown, not my favourite colour. 24, play-based learning. And 25, games and quizzes. And that should end it. Okay, cool. So, whatever you do if you're teaching year 9s, don't turn your back for 5 minutes like I just did. Goodness knows what will happen. Number 23, backward design and designing down. I just wanted to add in a planning one, even though we've done lots of planning stuff, right? So, I mean, all of these relate to planning. That relates to planning, that sort of relates to planning. These are activities you do inside a planning thing. That relates to planning, that relates to planning. The sort of differentiation, definitely. Sort of. Building on existing knowledge definitely relates to planning. These three things here, particularly the language and literacy one, because that is a continuum, and phonics to an extent, they all relate to planning. Now, watch that video if you have to be engaged in any type of planning. If you're a teacher aide and you're not actually doing any planning per se, you still might be working with a group of students on your own at some point, where this happens in rural areas quite often, where a teacher aide might be given 3 or 4 students to go and help improve their literacy in some way. So think about that. If you're going through and doing some type of teacher aide course, or you've done a course through a provider, think about whether you know, if you get told, go and help them with reading, think about whether you know how to go about doing that. And how I would do that, obviously, you're going to set goals. You'd probably use some type of explicit instruction or aspects of. You definitely want to watch my one-on-one instruction video, and you might chunk down that and you do some type of planning around it. Now, and also watch the language and literacy curriculum video, because that's certainly going to help you if you're trying to teach language or trying to teach literacy, which are 2 different things, by the way. So now, backwards design. Backwards design basically means that if you're planning something out, say that's your lesson, say that's your, not your lesson, your, say that's your year, let's say a term or semester. I'll use a different colour pen so that you can see the difference. So that's your term or semester, and this is month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, month 5, month 6, month 7, month 8. Say, that's a long term. Anyway, so the backwards design basically means you start here. Again, you're setting very specific goals, but you're starting here and you're just working backwards. So you know what the end point is. So the end point is, well, I want them to be able to read at level 6. And then actually what happens in backwards design is you don't really start there. You actually start at the start, because you have to build on their existing knowledge to some extent. You sort of need to know where they are at, but that doesn't usually involve some type of diagnostic process now. What we're really getting is students at the beginning of a certain year, say year 3, and we go, okay, this is where they're at, and this is where we want them to get at. You sort of know, and again, you plan to the masses, so you plan to the middle group, and then you differentiate out in the 2 different directions as you go across. But what backwards design really is about is figuring out specifically what your goals are, and then working backwards and going backwards. And I guess it's a bit of, and there's another strategy, I guess you call it, that's relevant to planning called elaboration, and that's where it sort of goes in that direction. So you're building on one, but build on the next, but build on the next, and build on the next. So one skill builds on the other. In this one, not so much, but it can involve that. But point is, let's say you want them to be able to do short stories by the end of them. You want them to be able to do some, say you want them to do some type of report, here, then at some point it's like, okay, well, they're going to have to learn about this particular period in history. They're going to have to learn about that. And to be able to do that, they're going to have to know the basics of how to write a report. And then down here, they're going to have to know how to do how to retrieve information from the internet type of thing. So you've got these various different ways of moving backwards, but the point is you start at the very end. And depending on what your goal is and how much time you got, then you're going backwards from the end. Now, that's the best way to explain that one. The next bit is that designing down, which is slightly different. And most of the time you will combine these, but designing down is basically where you've got your goal up the top here. And whereas this one, when we had the goal at the end here, remember it was that iterative process, or it was a elaboration process. So they needed to know this to do this. To do that, they needed to do this to do this. And it got more advanced or more complex. With this one, with the designing down, it's usually used when you can just equally chunk it into separate sections that don't really relate or flow on. So quite often they do, or some of them do, or some of them don't, which is why you might use a combination of these. So you've got your goal that floats above your entire year, and then you might have sub-goals. So that's another way to think of it, and then that's how you divide your program into various different sections. So obviously that can apply to anything, right? I'm just trying to graphically show that. That can apply to anything. It can apply to Year 12 sitting exams, adults doing whatever, primary school, high school, teaching piano, anything. Those different planning approaches. I guess the most important thing is just to be aware of what type of planning that you're actually doing so that you can try and think through whether you're doing it in the most effective way. So that's backwards design and designing down. Now, the last two here I wanted to add in because I've done a lot of cognitive type stuff, which is, I guess, a certain approach. It's kind of traditional, but certainly the most common type of teaching, I guess, used from year 3 up to adults. And so I wanted to add in something different for those early childhood teachers or early childhood teacher aides and educators, and that's play-based learning and games and quizzes. Now, games and quizzes can be used at any point. I use them as reviews and consolidation activities. You use them as part of your explicit instruction. In a way, it can be a guided and shared learning type activity. And I've done a video on quizzes and gone through and sort of shown how you can set a quiz up and how you can run a quiz with, say, year 9s or year 12s or whatever, but even year 5s or 6. Kids love games and quizzes. It's a good way for them to get in some deliberate practice, and it's certainly a good way to develop rapport. Obviously, there's a lot of questioning skills, a lot of feedback, and so on and so forth in there. So those quizzes, if you're running any type of program with kids, whether you're doing an intervention program and it's 1-on-3 or whatever, or you're teaching 32 in a class and you're teaching a second language or whatever it is, you should know about games and quizzes. They are used through all different age groups. And of course, games and quizzes is just a type of play-based learning for sort of older kids, I guess you could say. But even younger kids do use games and quizzes, and older kids still do some types of play-based learning, particularly this day and age where there's a lot of online learning that happens around that space where they're doing online games and things of that sort of nature. But even year 11s and 12s or even adults, they love playing games like bingo or any of those competitive games, whether they don't have to be get up out of your seat and move around type games. There's another thing that I'll add in there called movement integration, which is a fancy word for saying getting kids up and out of their seat. So I talk about that quite a lot in either that one, or probably both actually. Movement integration is a really important part of teaching, particularly when you're doing your planning stuff and you're not only just planning out whole programs, but if you're also planning out lessons and trying to figure out how you can help those kids and support the learning of those kids who have ants in their pants and they're always getting up out of their seat and they've got heaps of energy and whatnot. The more movement integration you can add in, it gives the better, because it gives them that outlet for their energy in a structured way where they're not going to get in trouble. So, and plus just a lot of the research is quite clear that if you get people moving, they conceptualize things quicker, they understand things and remember things better, and they remember the instance of learning a lot further into the future and so on. So there's a lot of different types of play-based learning as well. I don't think they're overly important, but as long as you understand that actually what is important with play-based learning is to know whether you're doing one of these three. Actually, I won't write it on there because I don't really have much room left. Structured, unstructured, or semi-structured play. So when you're developing a play-based activity for students, let's say it's physical play or creative play or exploratory play. So there's there's about 10 different types of play. There's probably 20, but I think in that video I go through about 10 or so. So let's say you're doing physical play. You can do that either in a structured way, so a highly structured way, or maybe not even highly structured, but structured way. A semi-structured way where you're setting some rules, but kind of letting students have a lot of choice, or the kids have a lot of choice. Or you can do it in unstructured, where you're basically just providing an environment that has some type of boundaries around it and saying, here are some rules, but really just go for your life. So that unstructured play is more so around, say if students are on their break or they're on their free play time and they can interact with other kids and do whatever they want. So you're there just watching them from a safety perspective, I guess you could say. Whereas that more structured play is games and quizzes, and then there's a semi-structured is not so much games and quizzes anymore, but it's where you're directing their play, almost along the lines of that constructivism that I keep talking about, that constructivist approach, where you're wanting kids to learn by interacting with the world in various different ways. So they might play with blocks and so on and so forth. So they're your three different types of play. Games and quizzes are very important for all the different age groups, including adults, so certainly watch those videos. So that's my top 25 teaching strategies in no particular order. I would recommend watching the videos on all of those if you've got a lot of free time, but I think they are really important if you're devoting your career to working in the education sector. You're not going to go wrong by watching those. You don't have to listen to everything I say. Take what's important to you or what you think works for you and put the rest to the side. Don't discard it completely, but put it to the side. If you like that one, that one, that one, that one, and that one, then practice those. You don't have to get good at all of these things at once. If you look at that language and literacy continuum, that's a bit of a nightmare if you've never actually thought about how to teach literacy before. So you're not going to watch that one the first time and then suddenly you're the world's best English teacher or anything. But it's a process of just learning a bit today, learning a bit next week, implementing it, practicing it, and getting better and slowly improving your pedagogical or andragogical understanding and skills. So the way in which you go about doing that thing of teaching, because I'll just tie that back in now with what we were saying at the start. And just have a think about whether your understanding of that analogy I used at the start has now changed. This person is trying to teach that information to that person. Probably should have drawn it into their head, right? So how can this person now, instead of just handing that information over, they actually need to use these strategies to be able to teach that person information. So just bear that in mind. Handing over information is not teaching, that's just handing over information. As part of that, we want to do all these other things, all these other strategies. Questioning skills, games and quizzes, setting goals, etc., etc. Okay, so I hope that helps and good luck out there.